Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Pennsylvania. I'm excited to have such a large group here, and we're happy to host folks in Pennsylvania. I'm going to provide, I guess, maybe a little shift and provide a state agency perspective. And I'm just going to give a little bit of history, but I think we're all a little bit familiar, but I'll breeze through this given that we have some folks from outside of the state. So Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, right? So Forest once covered about 95% of the state. And then, looking back, we had that history of resource extraction. So from the first oil well, that's the Drake well, to, coal and timber and transporting those things, which basically left a landscape that looked like this, heavy in water impacts and fires. We also were the beginning of the conservation movement, and hopefully all the Pennsylvania folks know that, at least the local ones. But it was a large change in how we moved forward in increasing and improving those resources in Pennsylvania. And I'm going through the history piece because this is a lot of how and why our organization was formed. It kind of gives you that foundation. So the Division of Forestry ultimately was set up in 1895 to gather and distribute information on forest fires or on forests, to prevent and protect from fires, and to restore and reforest those areas and provide watershed protection. So taking us from a landscape that looks like this to what it looks like today in most of the areas. And today we're at more than 16 million acres forested, about 60%. So that's where the forests are. And then when you look here, this is where the people are. And just a little bit about the Bureau, although Kelsey kind of rattled off a lot of the things that we work on. So we're protecting state and private forest lands from wildfire and insects and diseases. We promote sustainable forestry practices. We also conserve native wild plants, so any native wild plant, that's us, and we also list them T&E. We also have a statewide ecological inventory program. The heritage program coordination comes out of our department as well. And then we have 2.2 million acres of state forest land where we're looking at biodiversity, water, recreation, timber, mineral resources, and maintaining wild character. A little bit more about us, just to kind of paint that picture of how we're set up. We've got about 500-ish full-time staff, and then depending on the season, 100 to 200 additional seasonal staff. And just to get an idea of the fire side of things, so we do have a forest fire protection division, and they coordinate the suppression and protection efforts. So they'll work with staff on prioritizing the prescribed fire side of things, and then also the wildfire. So of course, we all know good prescribed fire time is good wildfire time, right? So often we're shifting staff depending on what type of fire danger there is, and then what types of activities we have going on. So depending on where you are within the state and what forest district you're in, you might be doing certain things, or you might be able to head out to, or we might be able to have that prescribed fire in that area. And this is where the state forest system is across the state. And so I'll be talking about Wildland Fire. So of course, hopefully everybody in this room is familiar with it's both the wildfire and prescribed fire side of things. So, we were set up to, one of the things that we were set up to do was address wildfires in detection, suppression, and prevention. And some of the ways that we did those things was the fire tower program. So we had over 250. We're down to something like 50 at this time, and we're doing some restoration of some of those areas. So that was the detection side of things. But we also set up a warden organization where you can see that we've got the chief fire warden, and then the district fire wardens, and then the 1,800 local forest fire wardens. And so they're properly trained local wardens to detect, extinguish, and investigate fires. Many of those are volunteers or state employees. Just a little bit on the fire history. Over the past 100 years, that wildfire history has gone down. As you can see, lately we have had two biggies. One of them was already mentioned, with 10,000 and 8,000 acres. In Pennsylvania, 98% of the wildfires are caused by humans, as you can see on those different impacts there, and most of them with the highest being debris burning. So then if most of them are human caused, those times where you have humans around those wildland areas, then that increases that risk with the WUI. So if you look on the left, that's the area. I don't know if you can see those words, but that's the area of WUI by state, and then also the number of houses by state. And so if you see, Pennsylvania is up there as far as the potential impact on the wildland urban interface. So I think that ends up being something like 17% of Pennsylvania is within that urban interface, and then that's something like giving a risk to about 250 municipalities. So here's a little detailed map of Pennsylvania, but that's 10 of the 16 million acres are within that interface. The 16-mile and Beartown wildfires were up in the kind of Pocono area, up in our Delaware State Forest. It was in 2016, and ultimately they burned 8,600 acres. But this is a good example of the demonstrated need to look at all of those issues together. Fire conditions, the urban interface, forest health, and weather conditions. So we had a high-risk fuels situation with fuels and homes there. It burned 12 days. We had about 200 firefighters at over 16 states coming to assist. This just shows you the wildfires, acres burned over the past 10 years. The last 2 years, 18 and 19, were pretty darn similar to 17. So the cohesive wildland strategy is essentially these three goals were identified by the U.S. Forest Service, so responding to the wildfires, having these adapted communities, and restoring these resilient landscapes. So the restoration, opening those doors for prescribed fire and having those resilient landscapes. I'm happy to see that it says only you can prevent wildfires, not forest fires. So I had a good slide in there. Okay, so moving from the wildfire side of things to prescribed fire. Ben had did a very good job of kind of introducing this for us to kind of go forward talking about it, but of course we have the council, and it is certainly an important component to us coordinating and cooperating, training each other, providing outreach and education, which then led to the act, which allowed us to have a legitimate tool to put fire on the ground. It provided those legal protections which Ben had described, but it also, showed to the public that we can use this tool properly with having certain burn plan requirements, a review process, credentials for the burn boss, and training standards as well. So this moved us into really being set up to develop and have a prescribed fire program. And I think we've seen multiple examples of this. So this one provides some information on all of the organizations in Pennsylvania on the left doing prescribed fire as far as the numbers, and then the acres, and then specific to the Bureau of Forestry and DCNR, number of fires and number of acres, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit. But as you can see, over the years, they've been going up. One of the benefits about Pennsylvania, and I had shown state forest land, but this is one with all public lands. We've got a lot of public lands in Pennsylvania, and so a lot of opportunity to apply some of these practices. So just to talk about some of the things that we do as far as prescribed fire, just to give you a kind of quick overview, is the collaboration piece is really important to us. Clearly the council is that conduit for collaboration, science, different ways to practice, and looking at and understanding different issues through case studies. let's see. So another important component for us is monitoring. So we do have required permanent plots before and then 2 and 5 years later. We're really looking at how the prescribed fire activity is affecting the land if we're hitting our desired outcomes. We also have a couple additional monitoring plots that we're doing, and some of that's being done through the Heritage Program as well, but it's through some landscape scale grants where we're looking at other herbaceous layers and looking at leps and different bird species as well. Of course, oak is an important component. It's a great tool. You know, anecdotally, generally, they perform better on porous sites. That seems to be a better response for us. And we've been looking at and focusing on larger collaborative burns when possible. So a lot of that is through the landscape scale, doing it with the Game Commission and other partners. Let me see. Essentially, part of our work is also to reduce those fuels, and we had been working in the, I think it's the Delaware State Forest recently, in decreasing that impact of the fuels to those nearby communities. So actually, this is the right picture. There just should be another one. In the far right corner, there is a house, and so you know, up in the Delaware, there are a lot of subdivisions kind of plunked down into the forest. So we were working to decrease the laurel in that adjacent subdivision. So within like a quarter-mile strip, developing a fire break and then reducing that laurel kind of load and then maintaining fire. We'll plan to maintain fire over the next 5 to 10 years. So the FireWise program is something that's beneficial for us in reducing that reduction in those urban interface communities. So for an organization that, you know, we have both the wildfire and the prescribed side of things, you know, there are challenges, and I think Ben had, at the beginning of his, said, you know, something like, folks list off a lot of the reasons that make it really hard to do prescribed fire, but those are some of those reasons that does make us hard for us to balance those things. So, you know, of course, the burn window, I see that's on the agenda for later in the day. You know, we have those cold, wet springs, and it does get challenging for us to, you know, do some of these prescribed fires across, especially if it's across a large landscape or if we have competing needs as far as wildfire as well. However, we are looking to expand those, and how can we not only have those small windows. So that's an important thing for us, is to look at how we can change those challenges. Cost is something we're trying to understand, but you know, if you're having these repeated mows, repeated burns, and maintaining those permanent fire breaks, those are costs that we need to set aside and plan for. Some of the challenges and concerns that we've heard from folks as we move forward is, okay, if we're going to be maintaining a lot of these areas that we did do prescribed fire, you know, how are we going to be able to move forward with new burns? So ultimately, there could be a challenge where we're constantly maintaining and moving forward. So those are some concerns that have been brought up, just as far as staff time. Of course, the wildland urban interface is increasing. One could assume if that's increasing the issues with prescribed fire as well. I was talking to the state forester from New York last week, and he was talking about some of the challenges of using prescribed fire in Long Island, which clearly has a very large urban interface there. Deer, you know, it's difficult for us to not be thinking about deer. We've been looking at targeting large landscape areas or burning near timber harvest to reduce that impact that the deer would have in those management areas. Thank you. Climate change, you know, almost every time you talk to somebody in the public, they're asking about some sort of invasive or pest or disease, or, you know, are ash going to be in the landscape? What about my hemlock? Things like that. So those are all things that you know, we have to take into consideration into our planning for the future. Is what are those storm events going to look like? What is the next pest? What is the next impact to those trees? balancing uses and values, and that was a great kind of opening in Erica's last talk, was all of those different issues that we're balancing, be it threatened and endangered species to recreation to all of those different uses and values that I talked about that we manage, within state forest or statewide. The good fire versus bad fire, we talked about that a lot with Smokey, so that's something that, we need to be in front of as far as that positive aspect of fire. And so, kind of in summary, ours is this challenge of balancing the prescribed fire and the wildfire. So, I quickly went through the history, but we're set up for wildfire. We're set up for that history of making sure and meeting our mandates of those wildfire requirements. And, and a lot of that is also coming from the federal level. So there's that new shared stewardship initiative, right? So that's very Western fire focused. But what we need to also do is respond to how are we addressing fire in the East? Are we ready, and when you're getting those federal funds, you have to document how you're addressing those issues. So it's certainly something that we have to think about and work to balance. And so I guess on the balance side of things, the prescribed fire is not an easy, simple, precise tool. You have lots of variability, and that's something that we need to work forward and balance, just like you would balance with after a wildfire. But another thing that we'll work to do is kind of balancing the training and having skilled staff to move forward with meeting those desired outcomes when we are working with prescribed fire. Monitoring is an important component to that. That's one of the things that is important for us to ensure that we are seeing those benefits, noting those issues, and then adapting as we need. I think that's probably the kind of key, is just having that balance. Things like this conference and then the Prescribed Fire Council, where we can all work together, learn together, and share resources, is an important way for us to move forward with taking these two different wildland issues and pulling them together to move forward, to have both as we try to meet these needs and requirements of the public and the resources. Thank you. That was a quick run through.